To close out a jam-packed transformation, we have a very, very special presentation by a sought-after speaker, strategist, and entrepreneur known for his insights addressing breakthrough technologies and their impact on a variety of industries and society in general. Salim Ismail is the executive director and global ambassador of Singularity University. He is also the author of Exponential Organizations. Today, he'll be discussing the future of enterprises and reinventing best practices, followed by a Q&A. When we get to the Q&A, there will be microphones around the four corners of the room. So all we ask you to do is either raise your hand or stand up and somebody will come to you with the microphone. Please help me welcome Salim.
All right. Good afternoon. All right. A quick question. How many of you have seen me speak before somewhere? Anybody? Okay. And how many of you have heard of Singularity University? Okay, a couple more of you. All right. So I'm going to try and make it worth your while for sticking it out right to the end of the conference. You heard a little bit about my background. For 6 years, we've been building out Singularity University. 2 years before that, for a couple of years, I was the head of innovation at Yahoo, and I ran their incubator called Brickhouse. And I found that when you do disruptive innovation or attempt it in a big company, that the immune system of the organization will come and attack you. Right? All of our, I see some nodding heads for people who've been through this loop. All of our org structures today are built to withstand change and withstand risk. And now we're asking for that to be the higher order bit. And so it's quite an interesting juxtaposition around that. We are based at NASA in Silicon Valley. We got initial funding from Google, Cisco, Nokia, Autodesk to get started. And we live off this particular curve, which is essentially a curve of Moore's law, the idea that we double the price performance of computation every 18 months. That's actually a logarithmic y-axis, and we've been steadily doubling computational power now for over 100 years. Ray Kurzweil, who put this chart together, asked the question, why is that curve so smooth and so predictable? Through wars, recessions, ups and downs in the semiconductor industry, you should expect much more of a jagged stock market type of a shape, not this kind of extraordinary predictability. And he spent about a decade doing research on this, trying to understand why this was the case. And he came up with a very fundamental observation, which is once you take a domain or a discipline or an industry area or a technology and you power it with information technology and it acquires informational properties, its price performance starts doubling very steadily. Most importantly, once that doubling pattern starts, it doesn't stop. It just keeps going, which has some fairly crazy upper limits to it. Peter Diamandis, our other co-founder, who's the head of the XPRIZE Foundation, just wrote a book called Abundance. If you've not read it, Bill Clinton has named it one of the 2 most important books you could read. He projects out that if we could harness these technologies effectively in the next 10 years, we could actually have an abundance of healthcare, education, energy, clean water globally. And what would the world look like in that case? We have today an abundance of information, and you're all washing in it as we see through this conference. What we've done is we've noticed that we've now seen that doubling pattern, that very steady Moore's law type doubling in all of these technologies. Artificial intelligence, 3D printing, robotics, synthetic biology, neuroscience, even energy are now, aspects of them are now doubling in their capability. We've brought together the world's leading experts across all of those areas to think about where does this go? What are the implications of this? We challenge our students and our participants to harness the acceleration that is inherent in these technologies, and the challenge we give them is come up with an idea that would impact 1 billion people within 10 years. Right? We're in Silicon Valley, of 3 weeks, off you go. We're kind of one part think tank, one part incubator, one part academics. Here's an example of one of the projects. This team was looking at poverty. They noticed that 85% of the roads in Africa get washed out during the wet season. And their question was, how do you alleviate poverty if you can't actually move anything around? In the middle of the summer, Chris Anderson from Wired magazine came and did a talk on drones. We're now all familiar with these quadcopter things. And they had the idea, why not use drones to move medicine and food around, especially where there are no roads? Here's a live test from Haiti where they're delivering medicine to a camp. What's interesting about these drones is you can carry a 4-kilo package about 10 kilometers today. That's the range and capacity of these drones. But the underlying technologies are moving so fast, they're doubling in their capability every 9 months. right? So by the end of this year, it's 8 kilos. By the middle of next year, 16 kilos. And that doubling just keeps going. And so we're teaching our participants to spot these doubling patterns, layer solutions on top of them. The solutions then scale with the underlying technology. You may have seen this announcement from Amazon where they want to deliver packages using drones. This is inspired by this particular project of ours. By the way, they had no such capability when they made this announcement, but they managed to get the story onto 60 Minutes the day before Cyber Monday. So it was a huge PR coup for their folks. They've now put considerable investment in them, and they're battling the FAA as to what are the legalities around this. Here's another example of one of our projects. This team launched a 3D printer up to the International Space Station 2 months ago, because a huge amount of the weight that we carry up there and a lot of the space taken up is multiple redundancy spare parts. If a valve goes bad, you better have a replacement, otherwise it's a life-threatening situation. But if you can print a replacement part in situ, very interesting possibilities. And about 3 weeks ago, we actually fabricated and manufactured the first ever man-made objects not made on the surface of the Earth. Right? So those are the types of projects that we launched. We've launched about 60 such different projects, all attempting to do fairly crazy things. Maybe the most, we also do shorter programs for CEOs, investors, government leaders, more folks like yourselves. This is maybe the most interesting one. We do a 4-day event with Deloitte and XPRIZE for CEOs of the Fortune 500. And you can see the logos there. Some of your clients are in that list. They come for 4 days of briefings on what do you do with these technologies and what are the implications and how do you organize for it. Essentially the content of this presentation expanded out over 4 days. We asked them beforehand, how aware are you of some of these breakthroughs? And you might imagine most of them said very little or zero awareness of some of these technologies. And half of the rest were probably exaggerating, right? Probably very little awareness. At the end of the 4 days, we asked them, how big of an impact will this have on your industries? And we gave them a timeline, 2, 4, 6, 8 years, and low, medium, high, game-changing impact. And this statistic really blew our minds. 80% of them agreed that these technologies would have a game-changing impact on their industries within 2 years, right? 100% within 5 years. And all of them had an urgent action item when they got back to the office. And that's essentially the gap that we're trying to bridge. Most people have very little awareness of what's coming down the pike. But when they do, there's this kind of oh shit moment where you wake up and you realize you better do something. Maybe the most interesting attribute of our model is, this is a photograph from our curriculum planning meetings. Because we're focused on such fast-moving technologies, we actually update our curriculum in real time. About every 2 months, we gather our entire faculty and we revisit every lecture. And we spend about 80% of our curriculum teaching the future, right? Most academics think about the past. How did this model evolve? How did this equation develop? And we project that forward and say, complement traditional academics to say, where will this go? When we get to the $100 genome, what does that mean? What applications does that enable? So let me run you through what we're seeing out there to give you some sense of where that's coming, and then we'll turn to the implications for your industry and for your clients. The first thing that's happening is we're digitizing the world, right? All of our relationships are now digital via social networks as opposed to analog. Our memories aren't in our heads anymore, they're in our smartphones, right? If you're below 30 years old, the appearance of your Facebook profile is much more important than how you're dressed that day. And we can tell by how they're dressing these days that's really the case. And we're transforming the human experience with this digital phenomena, all driven by this pace and change in computing. This is the original microprocessor from 1971 with the original patent there with 200 chips on the very first circuit board. And now we have teraflops of computing on the same physical space. The smartphone that you have has more computational power than the entire US government had in the 1980s, right? Which is why it runs a bit hot. There's quite a lot of computational power in there. And now we're seeing things like quantum computing and 3D chip design and so on that's going to continue that curve. Our prediction is that Moore's law continues uninterrupted for the foreseeable future. I won't get into this. Like anything quantum, it seems to work. Nobody knows quite how. It requires a fair bit of alcohol to discuss. So let's just skip right over that. But as we miniaturize all of that computation, we're putting it into everything. Right? Many of you have seen these statistics. 10 years ago, we had about 500 million connected devices on the internet. We're up today to about 11 billion internet-connected devices. We'll be at 50 billion at the end of this decade and 1 trillion shortly after that. So just think about that one metric. We're going from 11 billion internet-connected devices today to 1 trillion in the next few years. We think we're 30, 40 years into the information revolution. On this particular statistic, we're about 1% of the way there. We're literally just starting. So most of this disruption is actually ahead of us rather than behind us. And we're digitizing pretty much everything. This is an interesting company you should be aware of called Beyond Verbal. They can take a 10-second clip of your voice, and by analyzing the tonal variations, can come up with an 85% accuracy about what is your mood and what is your underlying attitude. Right? Try this on your spouse if you want to have an interesting discussion about that. This app called Moody's, you can download and try this out. Do tell your spouse if you're going to try this out with them beforehand. Of course, your spouse probably already knows your mood, but that's a separate issue. Customer service departments are using this, for example, if an angry customer calls, is their mood such that they're recoverable, or do you just hang up the phone? Right? How do you deal with that? So that's essentially how this can be used. But as we digitize emotion, we essentially can manipulate it in software, and what happens with that. What we're seeing is as these technologies become information-enabled, it becomes extremely disruptive. The best analogy we have found for this is photography. Some of you are old enough to remember film photography, right? You're operating upon a material basis. It takes a week to get your photographs back. It costs about $1 a photograph for your prints, et cetera. Most importantly, though, you're operating from a scarcity model. We optimize every shot very carefully and so on. When you shift the substrate and you change the substrate from a material one to a digital one, and you move to an information-based digital photography paradigm, 2 or 3 really interesting things happen. The first is that the marginal cost goes to 0, right? Essentially, we can take 1,000 more photographs, the cost is the same. The second, as a result of that, the domain explodes, and now we have billions of photographs out there. 20 years ago, I think we had 1 billion photographs a year processed in the US that year, film photographs. Today, per day, we're uploading 1 billion digital photographs to Instagram, Snapchat, Facebook, and so on. The third thing that happens that's really subtle but very important is you shift the problem space. In a scarcity problem space, I'm kind of taking courses in photography so I can optimize every shot. In an abundance problem space, we all have 8 copies of all our photographs on 10 different devices, and you simply can't find the good stuff, right? Because it's buried in everything else. And so you've changed the problem space. And this explosion that we've seen in photography, marginal costs going to 0, the domain exploding, and the problem space shifting, is essentially the same thing we're seeing across all of these technologies. Biotech, artificial intelligence, robotics, et cetera, all going through that same extraordinary pace of change. For example, if you take, let me just try this out. 3D printing, for example, is going through that explosion right now, where we've digitized our ability to manufacture something. 2 inflection points that we have found in 3D printing. The first is that you can make things like this that cannot be molded. Right? For the first time ever, we can fabricate objects without needing a mold, which is kind of interesting. But the more interesting thing in 3D printing is that it's always been true in manufacturing that a more complex object costs more. The design, the fabrication techniques, the materials, and so on. With 3D printing, for the first time ever, complexity is free. The printer doesn't care if I'm spitting out the yellow thing in the middle or one of the more complex objects around the side. And so this has quite a transformative effect in that industry. Here's a young lady that you may be familiar with who won a startup competition. She has created a 3D printer for makeup at home. So you essentially pick your colors and you print out the makeup at home. Think of the supply chain and all of the display booths and Macy's and so on. We know some executives in the cosmetics business, they're freaking out about this because how do they juxtapose with this, right? Central kind of question. This particular 3D printer can actually print out the electronics itself. And this came out 2 days ago. And it can print an entire drone from one end to the other. They're putting in the chip there. But it prints out all the circuit wires, fabricates the drone from the bottom up. You attach the propellers at the end, and the drone flies away. Right? So now you can create very complex multi-material objects with electronics wired into it, essentially for the cost of the materials themselves. So these are getting very sophisticated very fast. Another technology that's moving at this pace is artificial intelligence. The reason we use AI is we've not had an upgrade in our brains in about 50,000 years. We're hardwired to lots of old problems. If you were using a 50,000-year-old iPhone, you would not be very happy about it. We have lots of biases and heuristics in human cognition, sunk cost bias, framing bias, positivity bias, and so on. And we use AI to mitigate and compensate for these biases. This is a study of parole hearings in Israel. It turned out if you're coming up for parole just before lunch and the judges were hungry, you're going to go back to jail. If you're coming up for parole just after lunch and the judges are happy because they'd eaten, 30% more likely you were going to go free, right? Quite something, especially in people trained to be impartial, right? So there's a food bias, if you like, and you can use AI and data analytics and so on to spot these biases and gaps, and of course, you're using that quite considerably. When you take AI and you put it into things that move, we have, of course, robotics. You're all familiar with these $20 helicopters that all the kids are playing with. 5 years ago, that capability cost $700, okay? 8 years ago, it wasn't even possible. That level of miniaturization, servo motor stabilizer was just simply not possible 8 years ago, and now we throw it away in a toy. And of course, when it's that cheap, that many more people can play away at it and so on. Here are two drones throwing up a pole. One is throwing up a pole, the other one is calculating the trajectory in real time and catching it. Right? Now, most of us could not control that drone to that level of precision, right? So now we've miniaturized all those algorithms right into the device itself, which is quite something. Here's a fellow who's taken this to a whole other level. He's built a drone to follow his kid to school so he does not have to walk his child to school. I'm sure the kid has hacked it and is following the dad. That's another story. And here's where it's going. How many of you are familiar with Baxter? So Baxter is a manufacturing robot where it's a stock picking line. You move its arms and show it what to do, and it then does the stock picking from then on. What's really important here, the real inflection point that's been hit, is in industrial robotics, you always had to prescriptively program a robot. You had to say, pick up this widget, turn 90 degrees, go over here, put it back, and so on. If you change your assembly line, it took months to reprogram it. Baxter is adaptive. You move its arms to show it what to do. It then uses image recognition, video processing from then on, and doesn't need any more intervention. This fellow's smiling, but it's about to take his job, right, essentially. Takes 25 minutes to train, right? Quite extraordinary. And it's only $22,000. Doesn't take coffee breaks, does not unionize, does not get sick, right, mostly. Okay? And to show you a sense of how fast this is moving, the really expensive part of Baxter is the $10,000 robotic arm that's moving in like 17 degrees of freedom with a ton of like servo motors and sensors built in. This is Saul Griffith, one of our faculty. He's creating a replica of that $10,000 arm using pneumatics and compressed air. This can do 95% of the $10,000 Baxter arm, except this costs $35. And you see the step, every time we see a step change in innovation, we see orders of magnitude lopped off the price. And now suddenly Baxter becomes really interesting and very feasible to use at almost zero cost. We predict that in about 10 years, we will not need human labor for anywhere in the world for manufacturing. So that will have an interesting implication on jobs, for example. When you take AI and robotics fully to an extent, you have the Google car, which you're all familiar with, I'm sure. This car uses light radar to navigate its surroundings. It's now done 1 million miles on California highways and streets without an accident. Right? Most of us could not drive 1 million miles without having an accident. You can see the LiDAR unit at the top there. I'm sure Google thanked those pedestrians for participating in the research. They have no idea the car has no driver. And what's extraordinary here is that we thought, okay, the car is ready. Because to drive a car, you don't need artificial human intelligence, you need artificial horse intelligence, and we kind of have that now. We thought that the car's ready, but it'll take forever for a DMV to authorize it. And then to our surprise, 2 years ago, the state of Nevada authorized autonomous vehicles. Right? And we thought, okay, it's Nevada, they'll authorize pretty much anything in Nevada. Except Uber, by the way. Uber is not allowed in Nevada because it's too much money for the taxi folks. But then California to stay up with technology, Florida for the senior citizens there have all authorized autonomous vehicles. 2 months ago, California issued the first license plates for autonomous vehicles. Most people think this paradigm is kind of 15, 20 years away. We think it's like 7 to 9 years away. Right? We think this is going to move much faster. And this may be the biggest change in society we see in our lifetimes. I have a 3-year-old son. He will never get a driver's license. Right? In fact, teenagers in big cities today aren't bothering to get driver's licenses because they can just get around with Uber. Okay? We expect that the traffic capacity of existing roads and highways with no change to infrastructure will increase between 10 to 15 times with the introduction of this car. Right? So we see real estate values spiking in the middle of big cities because it's so hard to get in and out. Those will smooth out when it's 10x easier to get in and out. So enormous implications for where this goes. Again, this is going to kind of render a massive change in how we think about society, regulatory structures, insurance companies, et cetera, et cetera. Moving on to one more technology. Actually, I've got one more after this, but biotech and bioinformatics. 50 years ago, we found that life is actually information-based. If you kind of combine A, T, C, and G, the 4 core molecules of DNA, you get all of the diversity that we have in biology and some of the interesting life forms we have here in the room with us today. When you learn a new language, you learn how to read, then you learn how to do comprehension, and then we learn how to write. Right? We have learned how to read DNA now exceedingly well. This is the price per performance of DNA sequencing, and this is, again, on a logarithmic y-axis. At this point here, in the year 2000, it cost $3 billion to sequence the first full human genome. That was the price. Second one cost about $400 million. Third was about $50 million. Fourth one's about $14 million. Anybody know what it is today? It's $1,000. We've gone from $3 billion 13 years ago now down to $1,000. By next year, it'll be $100 to fully sequence a genome. By 2020, it'll be a penny. By the end of this decade, it'll be cheaper to sequence your genome than it will be to flush your toilet. Okay? And when you flush your toilet, we'll probably sequence everything that goes through there because it'll be an interesting thing to do to see what bacteria, viruses, illnesses, et cetera, you have in your body. We're now starting to understand the comprehension side. If you have perfect pitch as a singer, it turns out that's governed by a single gene. Drug dosages are now being governed by what your DNA sequence can deal with. And now we're starting to learn how to write. And when you write DNA, you're essentially transforming and synthesizing life forms, which has some fairly dramatic effects. There's a team working on the woolly mammoth. They're using elephant DNA as a baseline. We're about 2 years away from a live woolly mammoth wandering around. It's going to be a bit confused. Its habitat will have changed quite considerably, but you can see where this goes. And the implications of that are extraordinary. For example, when we think about conservation, the giant panda is alive today because it looks cute. Now that we can sequence its genome and bring it back, do we let it die off? What do we do? How do we handle the ethics and morals around that? And we'll be having some interesting discussions around that. Let me see if this works. This is a photograph from the iJump competition, International Genetically Engineered Machines, where teams of college students get together to hack DNA in interesting ways. And they have a contest to see who has the most creative use of this. 2 years ago, a team took resveratrol, the cancer-fighting substance in red wine, injected into yeast, started brewing beer with the yeast, and now you can buy cancer-fighting beer if you're a beer fan. This team has taken the DNA in a jellyfish that glows in the dark, crossed it with the DNA of a cat, and you can now buy this pet that glows in the dark. Right? Cat's not very happy about it. It can't hide anymore. And you can see the implications of this. And by the way, you can do this in your bedroom today. This is how fast it's moving. This is a photograph from BioCurious, an open source DNA synthesis hackerspace in Silicon Valley. The girl in the middle there is 8 years old, and she's leading the class. It turns out she's really good at holding the pipette at the right angles and knows how to run the Dremel fuses. She's teaching the adults how to do it. Part of the reason that we exist is how do we convey to her the ethical and moral implications as to what she's dealing with, right? These kids today are dealing with technologies that are billions of times more powerful than when we were kids. When I was that age, I was playing with chemistry sets, and the worst I could do was blow up the garage, right? She can actually change life as we know it on Earth. And so the implications of that are quite profound. This is a woman who can take a cigarette butt, and by analyzing the DNA on the cigarette, can recreate the face of the person that smoked it. Right? And again, this is something you can do today. Here she's creating a picture of herself, and a whole company has spun up to create mugshots for the police based on DNA found at crime scenes. I'm sure the NSA is all over this particular technology. Our joke is the NSA is the one part of government that actually listens to you, so isn't that a nice thing around that? And this is the inflection point that triggered all this off. Craig Venter, 4 years ago, who sequenced the first human genome, created the first fully artificial life form. He took the DNA of a bacteria, about 1 million base pairs, digitized it, modified it, changed it to his own specification, replaced the DNA of an existing bacteria, and we have, for the first time in the history of the world, a self-replicating life form, and its parent DNA is an email file. So we will now program organisms into place that never existed before in nature because we can just type out A, T, C, and G 1 million times on a computer. And so this has some extraordinary implications for technology and for the world. This is a company called the Arctic Apple. They've just gotten approval for marketing their product. What they've done is they found the single gene in an apple that when you bite into it, has it oxidize and turn brown. And they've turned it off. So if you bite into their apple, you leave it on the table for 4 days, it doesn't turn brown, right? And pretty crazy at one level, but very testable because they've only changed one little infinitesimal gene, and so very manageable from that perspective. This is one of our companies that's trying to take advantage of this pace of change. If we use 70 billion farm animals a year for meat processing around the world, if the middle class grows as expected, we'll need another 50 billion farm animals per year on top of that, and just that might destroy the climate. And so they're 3D printing and growing beef in a petri dish as opposed to hacking it out of a cow. Right? It tastes terrible today. Our joke is that the taste is doubling every year. We'll see how that works out. Their first product is leather, because they can actually grow perfect leather with no blemishes. And they're talking to car companies and fashion houses about this. And the cow is way happier when it can keep its own skin. And so this is a company trying to take advantage of this. And if you really want to take this to the full level, a recent development has been the study of the microbiome. It turns out that we have 10 trillion cells in the human body, but we actually have 100 trillion bacteria in our gut. And essentially what we are is walking bags of bone and flesh to host the bacteria inside us. It turns out they drive much more than we think. And we're starting to sequence the different populations of bacteria. And we're finding out we can treat all sorts of things like diabetes and so on just by changing the population of bacteria. If you really want to take this crazy, look up something called fecal transplants. And I'll just leave it there. Okay? All right. One last technology I'll touch on, and then I'll go to the implication of this is neuroscience. The acceleration in neuroscience is really in imaging. It turns out this is how we used to view the brain on the right, this lump of jelly. We can today spot a single neuron firing in your brain in real time. And what happens when we take all of these other very fast-moving technologies and interface it with this old organ that we simply don't know how it works? We still have no idea, by the way, why we sleep. We're doing some very fascinating things. You can get $100 headsets today that give you a pretty good fidelity readout as to what brainwave frequencies are going on in your brain. Here's a team out of Japan called Dreamcatcher. You go to sleep in an MRI machine. While you're asleep, they're storing the images coming off your visual cortex and recording them, and their objective is to play your dreams back to you the next day. Okay? My wife wants to get her hands on that. I'm kind of less interested in that, and you can see where this goes. By the way, today you have to lie down in an MRI machine. In a few years, it will be just a skull cap. And in a few years after that, we'll be able to do it at a distance. Okay? So when you can tell at a distance what somebody's subconscious thoughts are, that's going to have kind of an interesting impact in society. By the way, I'll make a prediction right here that with the beyond verbal tonal variation cameras that record facial twitching, et cetera, that in about 5 years, it will be impossible to lie. In about 5 years. So marketing departments have to be a bit careful. What will our politicians do is a whole other question around this. And this is going to be extraordinary. And again, this is doubling in its capability every year today, so quite something. And this is the reading part of it, right? To read the brain. We've also now started to learn how to write to the brain. And there's a technology called optogenetics where they've genetically engineered light-sensitive neurons. So if you shine a light on them, the neuron will fire. They've used a virus to distribute the neuron in the localized part of the brain of a mouse. They plug an optical fiber into the head of the mouse, and they essentially have mind control. They can make the mouse turn left, right, get angry, get hungry, get sad, et cetera. And essentially, we're talking about mind control over the internet here. Our old word for this, by the way, is marketing, right? You're all trying to convince people that if they see a Coke to get thirsty, et cetera. We've now information-enabled it to this level. Very Frankensteinian at one level, but very extraordinary possibilities. Researchers are hugely excited about the possibilities for Alzheimer's, dementias, Parkinson's, et cetera, when you can specifically turn on and off neural circuits. I don't have time to go through all of those technologies, but suffice it to say they're all going through that same explosion between digital photography and the old film photography paradigm. Let me lift up to talk about the larger picture here. The technologies are all very sexy, right? And we could go on for a long time, and we go into very in-depth briefings at our campus about this. But fundamentally, we are not ready for this. All of the mechanisms we use to run the world, our civics, our politics, our legal systems, healthcare, education, you name it, all designed for a world 200, 300, 500 years ago, not for the world of today. Definitely not for 1 trillion sensors coming down the pipe. We're going to need to re-architect every single one of our societal structures. And the reason that we exist as our observation is that our leadership structures are not set up for this. Business as well as political, all our leadership structures are set up to manage predictability and maintain the status quo, not operate in a world of crazy disruption. If I could get a bit of volume for this next video, I've shown you the polite version of the Google car. This is what it's like to actually ride the Google car. Okay, let me just play this video for you.
The Hans team will never believe this.
Oh my goodness. Go.
There's a bit of swearing in this stuff.
Holy shit. Holy shit. There's no fucking hands on that wheel.
So,
Oh my
sorry,
God. What?
It's driving itself.
All right, you get the general idea. That scream, do not forget that scream. That is the visceral scream of humanity meeting advanced technology, right? And when you first get in that car and it takes off at high speed through the obstacle course, and the car is driving faster than you could drive it yourself, and there's nobody in the driver's seat, you freak out. Your amygdala freaks out, right? And we all have this amygdala in the back of our brains that's constantly scanning for bad news, and this is why bad news sells. And so that freaks out. After about 10 minutes of riding in it, it's like getting into an elevator. Press a button, it takes you to the floor you want to go. But the first reaction is a freak-out reaction. What we're seeing around the world today is the world is freaking out on this information paradigm. We simply can't handle this. The Arab Spring is an example of that. The younger generation using information in a way that the older generation simply can't conceive of. This is the Prime Minister of Turkey from last year, right? A smart, thoughtful, intelligent, experienced guy making a totally ridiculous comment. This is him screaming, essentially, okay? Or the US, trying to use old structures to address new problems. Information may not want to be free, but it definitely wants to be liberated. And you definitely can't contain it in the old way that we thought of. We have to re-architect how we navigate all of these structures. We've been showing this image for 6 years since our founding. It's the Fourth Amendment scratched out, the right to privacy, warning that technology is taking us to a point where we will lose the Fourth Amendment in the Constitution. And now we're there. We do not have constitutional protection of privacy today, right? A fundamental pillar of American society has disappeared with no public conversation about it, okay? Driven by technology. Now, I'm Canadian, I don't have an expectation for privacy anyway, but if you're a US citizen, this is a pretty bad place to be. And you can't update the Constitution in this political climate, it's too crazy. And the Constitution is a software that runs a country, and it needs to be updated now and then. And so we have a perilously difficult structure now to deal with this. I mentioned our curriculum planning meetings. Even though we have the leading researchers, scientists, thought leaders in the world coming to teach, we can't become an official, accredited, state-sanctioned university, because to do that, you have to fix your curriculum and not change it, right? And it brings about the general question of how does any regulatory framework keep pace as technology accelerates away from us? We've just never seen this. For example, in higher education in our world, if you're doing a master's degree in one of these areas that we're teaching, advanced robotics, biotech, neuroscience, something like that, by the time you finish your master's degree, you're out of date. And we've never seen that before, that our ability to teach a subject simply can't keep pace with the pace of change in that subject area. Or in medicine, as the dosage of a drug is determined by my gene sequence and my DNA profile, how do you do clinical trials if your sample size is 1? Right? And again, that's a structural issue that we're going to have to overcome. So that's the kind of the regulatory and structural issue. Let me talk about the implications for business, and that'll bridge into where we're going with this. What we have seen is when we see industries that become fully information-enabled from one end to the other, you see this huge cliff take place. So here's the newspaper business trundling along, and then a 6x drop in revenues as eBay, Craigslist, et cetera, started to bite. Or the music business, same thing, huge drop. I know with interest it's called the media industry because they're trying to sell the physical media. But actually, it's an information service, and when you can go from YouTube, use YouTube to go from artist to listener with a video, all the intermediaries disappear, and there was a 10x drop in revenues in that industry. We expect that cliff, by the way, to hit the TV business this year as buying patterns can't keep up with the watching habits. Here's how badly we get it wrong. This is Vinod Khosla. He did an analysis of the exponential growth in mobile phones over the last decade and a half. In the year 2000, we had 100 million mobile phones out in the world, doubled every 2 years throughout the decade. And Vinod asked the question, how well did the mobile industry expert analysts predict that pace of change? So in 2002, he looked at Gartner, Forrester, Jupiter, McKinsey's, et cetera, found that they collectively predicted 16% year-on-year growth. Okay? 2 years later, it doubled, gone up 100%, so they were off by quite a bit. In 2004, though, their prediction was 14%. Then it went up another 100%. Their prediction in 2006 was 12%. Okay? And you can see what's happening here. At every point on this exponential curve, the experts in the field project linearly. In fact, in 2008, unable to spot 3 doubling patterns of 100% growth in 3 patterns in a row, their prediction was 10% growth in the mobile phone industry. And then it went up another 100%. How much more wrong can you be from 10% to 100%? You're 10 times off, right? This is not a math error. This is a fundamental misunderstanding of the underlying pattern that's going on. And he was able to show, by the way, not to pick on mobile phones, that this happened in network bandwidth, oil pricing, solar energy. Wherever you see that exponential curve, the experts in any field will project linearly, right? And in fact, it's a general heuristic that we have, a general cognitive problem. And let me give you an example. If I take 30 steps, 1, 2, 3, 4, I'll get to the back of the room if I get to step 30, and we can all project really well where I'd be a third of the way or 2/3 of the way in that prediction, in that projection. If I take 30 doubling steps, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, and I do that 30 times, at step 30, I'm at 1 billion. I'm 26 times around the world, right? Which is a bit further than the back of the room. And it's hard to predict where am I a third of the way or 2/3 of the way in that projection. And this is what the cognitive issue that we have today. We live off that black line, but information-driven environments operate on that green exponential curve. And we don't spot it early. Quick pop quiz. How many of you were aware of 3D printing 4 years ago? Okay, a few of you. 6 years ago. Okay, 10 years ago. Okay, very few, right? 3D printing is actually 35 years old. It is not a new technology. Okay, but it's been doubling away in its price performance from a very small point. So if your price performance is 0.001 and it goes to 0.002 and it doubles to 0.004 and it doubles to 0.008, it takes a long time to get to 1. Then it takes off, and then we say, oh my God, it's a black swan. Right? And so if you don't spot that curve early, it will disrupt you very badly. If you do spot it early, it's the biggest opportunity you could possibly have. And as we information enable more and more of the world, we're seeing more and more of the world ride that exponential curve. Let me lift up and give you some examples of where we're seeing this at an industry level. How many of you are familiar with the Tricorder X Prize? Okay? So Peter has a prize out, a $10 million prize for literally the Star Trek tricorder. A team will win $10 million when their handheld diagnostic device can beat 10 board-certified doctors in their diagnosis. Okay? So when a handheld device can beat 10 board-certified doctors, somebody will win $10 million. 300 teams have been competing for this. We're down to the last 10. We expect the prize to be given out within about a year. Okay? So by early 2016, we will have a handheld device that will beat most doctors' diagnosis, and you've just automated half of the healthcare equation, right? And the other half also rapidly being digitized. Think of the implications of that on the healthcare world. In emerging markets where they have a doctor per million citizens, this will be quite transformative. Hypochondriacs will have a field day with this particular technology, right? Checking the device nonstop. I'm sure it's wrong. I can't be healthy, et cetera, et cetera. That's just in healthcare. This is the leading contender called Scanadu. That's an entire pillbox. In that pillbox is an entire doctor's examination room. Or vertical farming. California is about to run out of water in about a year. 80% of fresh water goes towards agriculture. And we'll need to totally transform how we do that. We simply can't sustain that. We're seeing things like vertical farming be 10x, 100x more efficient with the use of resources. 7% of the vegetables sold in Singapore today are already vertically farmed. So we're reaching kind of industrial scale very quickly. Here's our old way of doing vertical farming, by the way, really, really hard. If you can avoid this, you want to avoid that. And maybe the most dramatic thing that we're seeing is solar energy. It turns out that the price performance of solar energy has been on a doubling pattern, doubling every 22 to 30 months, and has been for quite a while now. Okay? At this pace, we will hit 100% of world energy supply deliverable by solar in about 25 years. Right? More importantly, because it's on a doubling pattern, in 27 years we hit 200%, in 29 years we hit 400%, and that just keeps going. And so we expect to see an extraordinary explosion. Next year, solar will be cheaper than the US grid. next year. So we'll see a huge investment inflection point in solar. This is why everybody's kind of freaking out. The energy companies are freaking out today, and you can see the relative cost of solar out there. And let me frame it this way. If you add up all of the energy we have in all of the fossil fuels, oil, coal, natural gas, in the whole world, and add it up, that actually adds up to about 5 days of sunlight hitting the world. Okay? So you shift the conversation instantly from a scarcity problem to a conversion problem, and that conversion is riding that doubling pattern. So we're extremely optimistic about energy getting to this point. Of course, huge turbulence along the way. The Middle East is going to kind of collapse a bit. Putin is going crazy in Russia for that reason. He's got about a decade and a half of pricing and shelf life left in his reserves, and so on. The last piece of this, which is really driving all of this, is the sheer democratization of these technologies as the price drops to zero in many cases. A farmer with a smartphone in Africa has more information power in his or her hands than Clinton did when he was president, right? That's quite a profound thing to say, that we go from the richest person and the most powerful person in the world to one of the poorest in a generation. Google is the same for him as it is for Larry Page, right? And so extraordinary possibilities come out. This is one of our alumni, Emiliano Cargiman. He's Argentinian. He's launching nanosatellites. They're about the size of a shoebox. Once he has a mesh cluster of them up in space, he will be able to provide real-time video anywhere on Earth to a 1-meter resolution. Okay? His first 3 satellites have already launched. Okay? He'll be announcing this capability towards the end of the year and opening up an app store. So if you want an app like parking spots in New York, you literally write the app using the imagery coming off the satellite and do a rev share with them. Right? Think of the disruption on that and the opportunities that come from that. By the way, before he did this, he had no experience in the space industry. What we're seeing repeatedly today is entrepreneurs go into a field that they have no experience in, apply cutting-edge technologies, and have breakthrough results. Elon Musk being the primary example of that, operating in 3 industries, not just one. This is a company out of LA. We have one of the superbugs and antibiotic-resistant bacteria are one of the biggest concerns that we have in the world today because we have no cure. 200 people recently got infected at UCLA. A bunch of people died. You simply can't apply antibiotics to this thing. This team out of LA has solved the superbug problem. And it turns out as a side effect, they can cure all allergies. Right? That's the side effect. Kind of interesting. And they're a 10-person lab out of LA. It's not some thousands of people working for a big pharmaceutical company. You've all seen these $100 headsets that give you a neurological readout. I don't know if you can see this image, but in the right is a fellow called Will Henschel. He was a guitarist for the Eurythmics, the band from the 1980s and the London Beat, et cetera, et cetera. That's me on the left wearing a headset, and that's the readout from my brain. What Will is doing is composing music that when you play the music, puts your brain in the zone. Okay? So this is me before and after he plays the music, and you can see my brain flooded with alpha waves as the music bites, and now I'm in the zone. Because he's got a feedback loop, he can do this kind of very disruptive innovation, right, in neuroscience. Now, if you're Red Bull, you need to be seriously worried about this. Because if people start using this, people will drink less of it, or if you're a coffee company. So for many of your clients, it's not just the direct competition. Competition for all of your clients will not come from other big companies in the future. It'll come from people like this, doing very disruptive things from big companies. Right? That's the real danger. Maybe the most disruptive thing we're seeing today, in my opinion, is Bitcoin. There's a huge ecosystem being built up around it, and it actually has many of the characteristics that we would associate with a currency. But the real value in Bitcoin is actually the underlying blockchain. And if you've not researched this, it's really worth researching it. What it's providing, the underlying blockchain in Bitcoin, provides for the first time ever decentralized authentication. Okay? You know that a transaction happened, and you don't need a central authentication to validate it. So for example, a bank is basically a centralized authentication. It knows that you deposited $100, and it knows that we lent it out to you, and it maintains that ledger. Right? When you have the security of knowing that the transaction happened and you don't need the bank, what happens? In fact, there's a whole set of systems where we can apply, where we have intermediaries, voting systems, registries, multi-signatory contracts, many legal structures. We're close partners to Deloitte. I've advised the CEO that in about 10 years, their audit function will mostly disappear because the audit function is just ratifying and authenticating transactions, and these systems will transact themselves. The second huge area in Bitcoin to watch out for is actually microtransactions. Today, it's not worth doing a transaction less than about $1 because the transaction costs are too high. When the transaction cost drops to near zero or 1,000 times cheaper, all sorts of interesting microtransaction possibilities will be in play. How many of you are familiar with Soylent? Right? Soylent is a substance. This fellow, Rob Reinhardt, software programmer, got pissed off when he had to stop coding to go eat. Typical developer, right? And so he asked the question, why isn't there a protein shake that if I can use that for muscle building, why don't I have that for a meal replacement? And he found that there isn't one. So he spent several months working with nutritionists, biochemists, came up with Soylent, and basically it gives you a full meal, all of the vitamins, nutrients, carbs, fats, et cetera, that you need as a human being. People have now lived on this for like months at a time, and they've lost a ton of weight. They're healthier than ever because they're getting every single thing they need and not anything else. Okay? Tastes a bit boring, right? But most of us now eat. We go out to restaurants to have a good experience, not because we need the food. Right? And so this essentially transacts that. The most dramatic thing that Rob did was he open sourced his formula. There are now 1,500 variants of Soylent as he's open sourced the formula, and anybody can take it and cook it up at home or buy it from him or any of the other competitors. Extraordinary thing going on. So let me use that Soylent example to predict where does this go. From a business perspective, we're seeing most new business models are now information-based, and you're very aware of that. Mark Andreessen, of course, made this comment that software is eating the world. Now we're information enabling all sorts of other assets. Airbnb, you've heard from already. This is a graph I found from 2 years ago. Peter Thiel invested in Airbnb at a $2.5 billion valuation, or 40% of that of Hyatt Hotels. Okay? People said that's a bit crazy. That's a hell of a valuation for a startup. Peter had recognized this exponential curve. This is Airbnb's room nights. And maybe Silicon Valley is better at recognizing that exponential curve than most other places in the world. Here's how Airbnb's room nights have continued over the last 18 months. They recently had, actually my chart is out, they recently had 500,000 rooms occupied around the world in one night. Right? By the end of this year, at this pace, by the end of this year, Airbnb will be the biggest hotel chain in the world. And they don't own any hotels. Right? This is a fundamental inflection point. Kind of amazing to be the market leader and have none of the hassles or assets or workforce to worry about. Uber does not own its own cars. And so I've been looking at this phenomena as to how this is working, because we're now seeing this everywhere where you see an episodic asset. Like we all have a screwdriver at home for the millionth of a percentage of a time that we actually use the damn thing. Right? So at some point in the future, when you need a screwdriver, a drone attached to a cell phone tower will come and deliver it to you. We tried to deal with this at Yahoo. How do you deal with this very fast-paced innovation? And we found we just couldn't. And we're seeing increased volatility in the environment where large companies are now cycling through very, very quickly. Many of your clients fall into this bucket where they will not be around in another 10 or 15 years because of that volatility. This quote really struck at home for me. This is David Rose, one of the more famous angel investors in the world. He said, any company designed for success in the last century doesn't work in this following century. And this really struck me, like what is going on here? And so I've written this book called Exponential Organizations, and we're finding a new breed of organization that is operating in a completely different way than anything else we've ever seen. All of our businesses in the past are about getting an asset or a workforce together, putting a legal boundary around it, and selling access to scarcity. That's how we've been building businesses from the beginning of time, whether it's a design team or a media asset or a hotel on a beach, et cetera, et cetera. What these new organizations have learned how to do is how do you tap into abundance around you rather than trying to own everything, okay? And we found the benchmark statistic is that these new organizations are getting a minimum 10x better performance benchmark than their peers in the same space. How many of you are familiar with Quirky, right? Probably most of you in the room. Quirky is in the consumer packaged goods space, retail. If you're a Procter & Gamble, it takes you about 300 days to go from a new idea to a product on a Walmart shelf. Quirky does that same process, new idea to product on sale at Walmart in 29 days. Right? Unheard of in kind of an old industry, not a newfangled social media gaming industry. And we're seeing the same benchmark. We're tracking about 60 such organizations operating at this pace right now. And the question we've been asking is, how are they doing it? Right? TED is a good example. Nice high-end conference a few years ago. Chris Anderson takes it over, and he does two things. He releases all the TED Talks for free, and then he allows anybody in the community to go create a TEDx event. In 5 years, he's created a global media brand. Nobody has ever created a global media brand so fast, and his cost of doing so is pretty much zero, right? Absolutely unheard of. And so we've been looking at what makes up these exponential organizations, and they all have what I call an MTP. They all have a massive transformative purpose, okay? For example, Google, organize the world's information, right? Or Singularity, positively impact 1 billion people. Quirky is make invention accessible. And so all of them have this huge, they create a gravity well of this big purpose, and everybody gets attracted to community forums, and off they go. Coca-Cola, by the way, has just adopted that. Coca-Cola's new mantra is open happiness. Okay? So we expect to see brands morphing into this new paradigm in the next generation. We think brands will adopt this huge social purpose in this way. And then these organizations are using kind of a combination of 10 attributes to scale outside their core organization. The same way that Uber uses staff on demand, does not employ its own drivers, or Airbnb leverages assets that it doesn't own. Google and PageRank use algorithms to scale outside their own org structure. And the key here is that mission-critical business functions are not happening inside the core organization. Uber matching driver to passenger does not happen inside the organization. It's happening out in the wild, leveraged by technology. So they're using one of these 5 externalities, and then there's 5 internal mechanisms they're using to organize themselves. One is interfaces. Quirky has very customized processes to deal with the 1 million inventors in its community submitting ideas to them. So they're dealing with an abundance of ideas. They then rank, filter, match, et cetera, to decide what to take in. Or the lean phenomena. Many of you are familiar with the lean startup phenomena, which turns out doesn't work so well for startups, but works really well for existing companies. And the most interesting one for me is actually this one, autonomy. New organizations are starting up with completely decentralized org structures, no hierarchical, vertical, top-down. How many of you are familiar with Valve Software? Valve is a software company out of Seattle, does gaming. It has 400 people or so. No CEO, no reporting lines, no job descriptions, no management meetings, no middle management layers of any kind. They operate like a beehive. A team forms, they decide to go work on a certain project, and they self-determine what they want to do. Okay? Extraordinary. Valve gets more revenue per employee than Microsoft. Okay? Quite incredible that you can do this. Zappos is moving to that structure as fast as they can. And the second half of the book, the first half is what are these 10 attributes, ideas and scale, internal and external attributes. What we found is if you implement 4 or more of these 10 attributes, you get the 10x performance improvement. Right? So 4 or more of these 10 attributes will deliver the 10x performance improvement, because not everybody has all of them. The second half of the book is how do you do it? How do you apply it to a startup or a mid-market company? But a third of the book at the end is how do you apply this to big companies? And that's the most relevant for your group. I'll touch on what we talk about there. The first is educate the leadership that this disruption is happening, right? You all have the problem that you go and work with the marketing thing, created this incredible new digital or brand experience. You take it back to the rest of the business, and they don't want to know, or they're just not able to deliver. And this is a structural issue that you're going to need to help your clients guide them through this. So, for example, Deloitte brings their CEOs to us. We have an educational mission, so we freak them out. Deloitte picks up the pieces. So essentially the value exchange there. So the first is update the senior management, and more importantly, the boards, that this radical transformation is happening, because that gives you the permission to then go do interesting things. The second one is maybe the most radical and most interesting. It is our firm thesis you can't take these existing big companies and turn them into this newfangled exponential organization structure. It's too radical of a change. And you don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. So most big business transformation projects fail, as many of you know. But what you can do is take the change agents inside the organization, many of which you work with anyway, take them to the edge of the organization and build one of these off it. The company that is best at doing this is Apple. Apple has built the biggest company and most valuable company in the world. They have a nice design capability. They've got a technology supply chain that's optimized to deliver margins. But their real innovation is an organizational innovation. What Apple does, unlike any other company in the world, is they take a small disruptive team, take them to the edge of the organization, keep them completely stealth, and they say, go attack another industry. Right? So they started with music, and then phones, and then tablets, and now payments and healthcare and cars and God knows what. There's no theoretical upper limit to their market cap, because they're using their information-enabled capabilities to just go attack industry after industry. We can't figure out why no other company does this. Right? They're starting to, Amazon is doing some things, Google is doing a few things like this, et cetera. But we think this will become necessary in this new world for existing companies to look elsewhere because their own markets are going to get decimated. Again, I don't have time to go through all of these, but big companies are doing some very interesting things. Amazon has a really fascinating policy called the institutional yes. In any big company, it's really easy to say no to an idea, right? One of 50 people can say no and your idea is dead, and it's really hard to break through that. Amazon's policy is that if you have an idea and you come to me, my default answer has to be yes. If I want to say no, I have to write a 2-page thesis as to why it's a bad idea and post it publicly inside the organization. So they've created friction and embarrassment to saying no, meaning that many more ideas get tried out, tested, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? One of the results of this was Amazon Web Services, one of the most successful products of all time. Nobody could figure out how do you say no to this thing, and eventually it got exciting enough that they put considerable investment into it. Okay? So very interesting things that big companies are doing. I mentioned the autonomy example where people are operating with decentralized org structures. We thought, all right, that works great with kind of a Silicon Valley ethos or a cute gaming company. It wouldn't really work for an operational environment, especially in a regulatory environment. And then we came across ING Direct, specifically ING Direct in Canada, which is a very regulated banking environment. ING Direct in Canada has no CEO, no reporting lines, no job descriptions, no management meetings, no middle management. Okay? Incredible that you could do this. So when they do an online promotion, everybody swarms to the phone banks. When it's regulatory reporting time, everybody swarms to those systems. They do 4 times as many. They do 4 times as much customer deposits as compared to any of their peers. They have 7 times more customer accounts per employee than any of their competitors, just from this one attribute. Right? Incredible that they're able to do this. So now, the book came out in October. I got a nice award, a couple of nice awards from it. You can feel free to read it out. Most importantly, I've created a diagnostic survey at the back of the book that's also online on the website. And you can actually go through and score your clients to see how scalable is their org structure. Right? And so that's an interesting discussion you might want to have with your clients. Go click on the survey on the website, and for free, you can just create a 20-question score for them. Let me touch on your industry. As we turn the world into a digital environment, our opinion is you actually need brands much, much more than before. When you have an abundance of information, each brand becomes a lens and a filter to manage that experience with the outside world. So we think brands become even more important over time than they used to be, and absolutely critical. We think brands will morph into this massive transformative purpose, as I mentioned. But there's some really interesting things happening. First is brands are becoming utility and social support, as we've seen the IKEA taxi and other examples. Very, very tribal with this quantified self, luxury brands, groups, and affiliations taking off. Because as we turn the world more digital, you need that social connection even more to make sense of it. Okay? Huge psychological changes in neuromarketing, self-help, quantified self. And then, of course, you've got the whole social thing going on. There's a very fundamental inflection point that's happening on the internet, by the way. The first generation of internet companies, Yahoo, Google, AOL, said, we'll store your information for you up on the internet. The second, Facebook, LinkedIn, said, we'll share it for you. This next generation is saying, we want to share but not store. And so we've had a complete flip around in the value proposition for these Snapchat, Instagram, and so on. And the big question for the incumbents is how do you, if you can't store the information, where's the value proposition come from? This is why Facebook is spending so much buying WhatsApp. They have to buy their own disruption, otherwise they'll be wiped out. Basically, our thesis and our suggestion to you is be aware of these technologies, set a team up to go investigate them, jump on this information-driven bandwagon that's going to dominate the world, and you're going to have to help your clients through this transformation. They will not be able to do it by themselves. Their competition, as I mentioned, is going to come from young startups doing crazy things with them. So with that, let me pause there. Let me mention that this pace of change is not slowing down. It's actually accelerating. If this actually was a linear pace of change, exponential, it would actually be linear, but it's actually tilting upwards. Okay? We had, I'll skip through this and I'll get back to this in a second. We had 1 billion people online in 2010. We're up to about 2.5 billion people today online. We're going to be at 5 billion by the end of the decade. 3 billion new minds are coming online this decade. It's the biggest business opportunity in the history of mankind being created today right under our noses. And all of these 5 billion people are going to have one of these. This is the new Indian Akash Android tablet. It's a 1 gig Android tablet with a camera, Bluetooth. It's a phone as well. This is $35. Right? It's dropping in price 50% a year. Oh, I've noticed I've cracked my screen. I don't care. It's 35 bucks. Right? And we'll be giving that out in cereal boxes soon because you won't be able to sell anything to those 5 billion people if they don't have one of them. And so as the entire world comes on, what becomes possible? And then how many of you are familiar with the Google Loon project? Can I see a show of hands? So Google is launching high-altitude balloons, weather balloons, to deliver broadband internet access. They're using stratospheric winds to navigate around. This is a great kind of closing to this. When they first announced this project, there were 2 buckets of naysayers. The first were the balloon experts, who said there's no way you can keep a balloon aloft for so long. No balloon stays up for more than about a month or month and a half. Your project will totally fail. We're the balloon experts. We know this. This is what we do. The second were the telcos, who said there's no way you're delivering broadband from this thing way out the hell up there. The power requirements are too high. You can't get that far down, et cetera, et cetera. 18 months later, the balloons are staying up for 8 months, not 1, and they're delivering 40 megabits broadband of broadband. Okay? So by the end of this year or middle of next year, this service will be live, free broadband anywhere in the world, and then you add to that the tablet. What will that do to the world? Okay? So let me pause there. Thank you very much for allowing me to close the conference. Hopefully it's been good. We have a few minutes for questions. Thank you. I covered a few different areas there, so if you have any questions, throw up your hand, go to a mic, and then we'll come to you.
I have one. Sir, I have one.
Where are you?
Mike Donahue from the 4As, and I have this question. Does Singularity University and your exponential organization accommodate the absolute imperative that everything has to start with story?
Yes.
And, just like Simon Sinek wrote the book Why, and all the what's, that's how, all the stuff you facilitate, but where does story fit in?
It's absolutely critical, and this is why we're so interested in your industry, because you're masters of that narrative, the arc of the narrative, the media that goes along with it. If you get a bunch of geeks driving this forward, it all gets stuck and everybody gets pissed off and the conversations don't happen, et cetera, et cetera. And so this is why we're very interested in partnering with your industry, because we need to be able to tell that story in a managed way to navigate this transition in a seamless way. Think of it this way. In the 1500s, we had the Gutenberg moment, and the printing press changed everything, right? It's like we're having 20 Gutenberg moments at the same time. And we are simply not set up to absorb that pace of change from a social, from a business, or from a political environment. And so we're going to need to make that transition, and storytelling is the primary vehicle around that. So totally would love to partner with you. Yes?
Fantastic presentation. At the beginning of the conference, the CMO of Bank of America talked about the dwindling middle class. And so this idea of abundance, and there's more of everything. Curious about distribution of wealth. We see robots replacing people.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that and just global poverty?
It's actually a great example. Thank you for bringing that up, and a good question. Where does this go for income disparity, wealth distribution, what happens to all the jobs, et cetera, et cetera? Okay. The first reaction when you hear that all the robots are going to take over the job, and by the way, 47% of white-collar jobs in the US will be replaceable by machine learning by the end of this decade, okay? 47% of white-collar jobs, forget blue-collar. So we're in for a radical disruption on that. The first, your amygdala, right, goes straight to the negative things. We go, oh my God, this is a mess for society. It'll destroy the middle class. Income disparity goes up. But actually, when we look at the real data, it turns out that as we introduce more jobs into a certain sector, the jobs increase. Because you need the people to do all the analytics and analysis, creative thinking around how do you apply these. So we have firm evidence now that the introduction of robots actually increases employment. So that's an important data point. The second is, in terms of the wealth distribution, we like to frame it this way. Today we view the world as the haves and the have-nots. And actually where we're going to is we'll have the haves and the super haves. Okay? You'll always have people that don't have much. What we're doing is constantly moving the goalpost. So if you look at people that are below the poverty line today in the US, 99% have a fridge, 98% have a TV, 85% have a car, right? 200 years ago, the richest person in the world didn't have those things. So we're moving the goalposts very radically around that. Also, the if you take extreme poverty, it's measured by the UN, extreme poverty around the world has dropped 80% in the last 3 decades. Right? It's this absolutely magical thing that's happening. We're lifting the entire world out of extreme poverty. Now, you hear the horror stories, but it's actually at orders of magnitude less than it used to be, the famines and so on that are going around the world. So we'll see very, very huge disruption, but in general, the trend line is that we're making the world much, much more prosperous. And of course, when you have 3 billion new mines, et cetera, coming online, very interesting things happen. I'll give you one easy example that shows the direct connection between delivering technology to the edge and economic disparity. When the tsunami happened in Indonesia a few years ago, the government dropped in cell phones to all of the fishermen because all the radio control towers and all had been wiped out. What they found was their incomes increased 30% within a month because they could text back and say, what are the market prices? Do I stay out fishing? Do I go back into cell? And just that allowed them to increase their incomes by 30%. And so we're going to see this ability for technology to deliver value to the edge in an incredibly new way, and we get very, very excited about that. So we're very optimistic around the world. You might be able to tell we tend to be optimistic about where the world will go. In the kind of a decade and a half to 2 decades, we see the world having an extraordinary abundance of resources, energy, food, clean water, for example, we're not worried about. Population growth will peak at about 9 billion in 2050 and then actually drop after that. We're really worried about how we get from here to that through that next couple of decades. That's our huge concern point. Okay? Other questions? Yeah.
Fantastic presentation, thank you. I've been reading about artificial superintelligence, and when do you think that artificial intelligence will surpass human intelligence?
All right, that's a kind of a loaded question. Let me answer that in a couple of different ways. The question is, when does AI beat human intelligence? That's actually called the technological singularity, a term coined by Vernor Vinge, the science fiction writer, going straight back to the storytelling concept. By the way, just as a little aside, if you were at CES this year, you saw that Lowe's won all sorts of awards for their Osh robot that does navigation around the orchard supply chain. And they have a telepresence robot. That's actually done in partnership with us. And they use science fiction writers to think through where does the future look like, and then they drive that to technology. So interesting side segue there. But in terms of AI and superintelligence and AI's beating, when you look at we have a couple of issues with that framing. The first is that we don't know what intelligence is, right? We measure logical thought processing, but there's emotional intelligence. There's the concept of awareness, the Eastern concept of presence, there's spiritual awareness, et cetera. There are many dimensions to intelligence. We only really measure about 1/12 of those facets. So that's one issue. And the second issue we have is what would constitute overtaking? The minute an AI or a robot can repetitively do a task, it's going to be much better at it than a human being anyway. And so the way we see this evolving is AIs are evolving in a very, very different way to take on tasks that we're not naturally good at. PageRank, for example, crawls the web and kind of archives and indexes all of the web pages in the world. It's a terrible task for a human being. We are not good at it at all. Okay? And so an AI is much better than that, but that AI looks very, very different from the way human intelligence works. So we think what happens is we have human intelligence going this way and artificial intelligence evolving in a completely different way, and it basically increases what you're able to do in a very dramatic way. You'll hear the fearmongers kind of go, Elon Musk, for example, a few days ago said, we should really be worried about AIs, et cetera, et cetera. When we look and talk to the AI community, they're very carefully putting in control mechanisms, kill switches, et cetera, around that. And so we think it's a very different thing. The third part is one of the questions we often get asked is, when will a robot become conscious? Or when will an AI become conscious? And again, you have a big issue there. We don't have a definition for it. We don't have a definition for consciousness. We don't have a test for it. A subset of consciousness is self-awareness, right? You look like you're self-aware, so I attribute self-awareness to you. I feel like I'm self-aware, but my wife disagrees. And so kind of you don't even know where to start with that discussion. So unless we have a clear definition and a test, it's very hard to discuss these concepts. But in summary, we see AI evolving in a completely different path and doing things that human beings aren't good at or can complement our human capabilities. We don't see it supplanting human capability. Okay? Other questions? Question there and then a mic here. Yes?
Salim, I took your advice and downloaded Moody's.
Okay, can you hold the mic a little closer?
I took your advice and downloaded Moody's
Yes.
on my phone.
Okay.
And I took a read of you.
Okay.
One at 11:01 and one at 11:48.
Okay.
And it asks me whether I agree or disagree with its reading, and I can't answer that question. So
Just agree with it.
I wanted to ask you, at 11:01, you were controlled sentimentality,
Okay.
ideology, vision, enthusiasm, and conviction. And at
Sounds good to me.
11:48, you had conflict between desire and norms.
Yes.
You agree to both?
I was probably talking about the social disruption that's coming, and we have a huge concern about where that comes in, and we're very conflicted around how we deal with the future of political environments, et cetera, et cetera. So that's probably what was reading there, if I had to guess. What we should do next time is do that while I'm speaking, correlate the mood to the slide, and then I'll be able to correlate it much better. But kind of frightening, right? What's possible in terms of that capability. But I would go with the first one, enthusiastic, optimistic, super intellectual, modest, all of that stuff. Okay, other question? Yes.
So given the pace at which the change is occurring, I would contend that the pace of government adaptation to that is slowing at an equally aggressive pace.
Yes.
How can politics, the government, and our institutions ever hope to legislate, regulate, and support this kind of change?
Okay, how do you regulate and support this kind of change? Okay, there's kind of 2 or 3 answers to that. One is, government progress is kind of an oxymoron, right? All of our structures are set up to slow the environment down. Bitcoin, for example, they've said, let's tax it, because you can't, if you shut it down, it'll go underground, so let's just slow it down as much as we can to try and understand it. So what the government structures are set to do is slow things down. The second answer is we do see some interesting surprises like the Google car. We thought that it would take years for a DMV or a DOT to authorize it. So what we'll see there is that different economic zones, regions, or countries or cities will start competing to see who has the most adaptable regulatory structure, because then businesses will flood there. Whoever figures out how to navigate the future of medical regulatory structures is going to see a massive influx of R&D. Right? And so we're actually having some discussions with certain countries around the world about what this might look like. The government of Andorra, which is a pokey little country between Spain and France, about 70,000 people, but it's not an EU country, has said, here, have our country use this as a test bed for anything you want to do. And our legal people are freaking out, saying, do we sign a treaty? What do we do here? We have no precedent for this. So we're looking and talking to different regions to see what would that look like. On the third part of it, the first part of your question was governments tend to slow this down. We're seeing a huge anti-Luddite revolt against these technologies, right? George Bush, for ideological reasons, tried to restrict stem cell research here in the US under pressure from religious groups. All the researchers went to China, Canada, Australia. Stem cell research continued exactly at the same pace. The US went from #1 to #8 in the world. What we've learned from that is you cannot slow it down. It's going to happen. Your best bet is to surf the edge of that wave and be ahead of it. You can't slow it down in any real way. And you can't, because these technologies are so democratized, you can't control it. No regulation. So the FAA has just announced its guidelines for drones. There's no way of policing that. Right? You could load up a drone with C4 and do whatever you wanted to do. You couldn't track it. You couldn't stop it. Right? And a bad actor is not going to listen to the regulations anyway. And so all you do is slow down the constructive uses of that innovation. So this is the biggest challenge that we have, to the extent that my favorite example of this stupidity today is Rick Scott and the Republicans in Florida have forbidden the EPA in Florida, expressly forbidden them from using the word climate change, global warming, or sustainability. And Florida is 3 feet over sea level, average, and we expect a 4 to 6 feet sea level rise in the next few decades, and they're not allowed to talk about it. Not a good idea, right? At least talk about it and see where this goes. You may disagree with the science, et cetera. So this is going to be the structural issue that we deal with. And frankly, it even brings us to the question of what is the future of democracy? Democracy is not compatible with the future of 1 trillion sensors out in the world, right? And so we're actually going to need to re-architect that whole thing, which is not something our existing systems are set up for. One more addition to that is that our existing systems are not set up to adapt to this new world. Our healthcare systems, education systems, for example, are wired in textbook publishers, regulatory teachers unions. You cannot adapt to this new world. You have to actually create new systems at the edges and migrate to those and let the existing system implode, which means a very different type of a governance model going forward. Okay? So that was a long answer to some questions. Question at the back, and then we'll go here to this lady here. Yeah.
I mean, besides your book, what sites and publications can you send us to that would give us the most information on what you've presented today for us to stay on the pulse of everything, all the changes?
Sure. So if something to look out for is anything that becomes information enabled, starts hopping on this paradigm, right? So we have singularityhub.com, which is our kind of TechCrunch type site that's constantly reporting on this. We have kurzweilai.net, which is dealing with really cutting edge breakthroughs in nanotechnology and robotics and genetics, et cetera, et cetera. Another one would be the MIT Tech Review, Wired magazine. Typically what we see in our classrooms shows up in a Wired magazine about 2 years later, and then in kind of Forbes 2 years after that as it becomes mainstream. So we're typically about 3 years ahead of mainstream publications. But if you do these cutting edge areas, we've also released about 30 or 40 of our videos online for free, our lectures, so you can go watch those and be up to date. But it's more important to understand the exponential doubling capability and track those, watch for doubling patterns, and have your researchers watch for them and track stories along that paradigm. Okay? I think we have time for one last question, then we're going to wrap it up.
Oh, well, I was going to ask if my flight's at 5 o'clock, and I was hoping you could just talk until then.
I believe there might be, but anyway, yes.
So that's a no.
Okay. Happy to chat after this. I'll hang around for a little while.
My question is, you just made a statement about education, and I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about the future of education.
Okay, so the way we do education today is a push system. You get a bunch of kids in a classroom and you try and shove algebra into them, right? Mostly they're thinking about lunch. This is a 400-year-old model. This is not new. We have no mechanism to update that model today. The Common Core is a joke. In terms of our understanding of pedagogical techniques, neural retention, customized learning habits, testing frameworks is 1,000 times ahead of the existing system, and you cannot update those existing systems. We need to turn educational systems into learning systems. So, for example, the half-life of a skill, if you learn to be a master, our old model of education was you became educated and you learned a hard skill through your mid-20s, and then you were a productive member of society from then on. Well, today, it used to be the half-life of a skill like welding. If you became a master welder, that would last you about 30 years. That was the half-life of that skill. Today, that half-life of a skill is down to about 5 years. Okay? So we don't know what the kids will need to know in 5 years. What do we teach them? That's one structural issue, right? We don't know what the jobs will look like in 5 years. So we don't know what to actually teach them. The second part of it is, so you need to shift from educational systems to learning systems, and kind of educational learning becomes an ongoing partner with an individual throughout their lifetime. Okay? So for example, we have investors that come to SU once a year to update their investment thesis because they're constantly then looking out 3 to 5 years ahead to seeing what technologies, what breakthroughs might occur. So we'll need to see that type of a paradigm. Note that when you take a new job and a new role, the first thing you do is learn everything there is to know about that domain, and then you apply it, right? So as we formalize that structure, that's where we'll go. For the kids, where we're going to see this happen is you're seeing things like the Khan Academy. How many of you are familiar with the Khan Academy? So 6-minute videos is about 3,000 clips of them online on all sorts of topics. The Gates Foundation has funded this. And there are now schools that are creating a curriculum saying, if I need 10-year-old mathematics, here are the 8 videos that a kid should watch. The teacher then becomes the guide and the mentor that was always the intended role of a teacher. We don't see the evaporation of teachers. We see the increased importance as guides and mentors rather than giving the same lessons 60 times over. We see them as a partnership. So what we're seeing is called the classroom flip happening, where kids will watch videos and learn the material at home and come to school to do homework and then collaborate, interact with others, et cetera, which is the model. So there's a number of different models around this, but suffice it to say our existing system is hopelessly really broken. On that optimistic note, I think we should end this, but thank you very much for your time, and if you have further questions, happy to do it. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay. I don't know about everybody else, but my brain hurts now. That was amazing, and like the person who asked the question, I could listen to him for the rest of the afternoon. Before we wrap things up, let's have one last look at the digital paint wall. Pretty amazing. If you get a chance, it's behind the stage. It's really pretty cool to look at. I just want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank Allison Fahey and Bill Tucker for programming the last couple of days. They did an incredible job. I also want to thank our events group led by Brenda Major, along with Troy Starwalt and Michael Boyle and the rest of the team for pulling this thing off, because it's never easy. So thank you all. I really appreciate it. And last but not least, we will see you next year in South Beach, Miami, at Lowe's, March 21st to the 23rd, and hopefully it'll be just as nice weather. Thank you all for coming. See you next year.